So yeah, I was looking at let me see if I can see the chapters and the number of pages. I just realized that this book is massive. It has 600 and it continues 600 pages. Um, but you have to take into account that Sergio put YAML, right? In the middle of the book, there's a lot of pages with Kubernetes YAML. But regardless, I was looking forward to the other chapters and reading, and it covers almost like all the topics in Kubernetes, right? It just happens that he has an example to show it on an edge use case. So yeah, this book, I this morning I wrote a recommendation in Amazon books. So I'm going to plus one from me. Like it's a book if you want to really go deep and learn that stuff, you can. Like anything in tech, he has good examples here. But at the time of the writing, they were working, they were using the latest version. But if you use it today, right, the versions of the technology runs so fast that they change. So it might not work, or you might not change the YAML. And he pointed it out, saying like, I use this specific version at this time, and this work at this time. Anyway, this chapter 6 and 8, the 6 talks about Ingress controllers and certificates. It talks about the Ingress object in Kubernetes. If you notice here, I don't know if people can see the highlights. It says v1/v1. For the longest time, the Ingress controller was beta. And then recently, like, I don't know, I cannot remember, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. We're talking about Kubernetes is 10 years, right? So when it's relative. It changed to V1. And the reason they changed to V1 was they wanted to make it the market as like, we're not going to like keep designing this object or service resource again and again. We want to market V1 to make it like done and done. Like that's it. It stays on V1, but there's not going to be a V2. The kind of V2 is the API gateway API. That is a different project. That is, people call it Ingress V2, but it's called the API gateway API. But Ingress is very popular. It's used everywhere. It works for the things that it does. It doesn't do canary. It doesn't do like traffic shifting, for example. That's one of the use cases that were very popular in service mesh before API gateway, and then now in API gateway, those type of features are in that other project. And then Ingress is just some the features that always had since beta or such. So an Ingress object, you can specify in here, as you can see, he's specifying the Ingress class. It's called nginx. So you have to specify a controller or the type of controller that is going to manage this resource. Kubernetes doesn't come with an Ingress controller. Just wanted to highlight that if people are not aware. So if you create an Ingress object and nothing happens, it's as designed. Is you need to have a controller that handles these objects, and since you can have more than one controller, then you have to specify which controller to use. At some point, always was an annotation. I think in V1 they added the spec. So you put Ingress class name and you put it in nginx, so you put it under the spec. Does somebody remember if that was a change on V1? I think so, but I'm not sure. But anyway, use the spec. It's kind of like the standard way of specifying what is the class of Ingress. Any questions so far on Ingress? It shows here how to install the Ingress controller. Installing Helm. Okay, so install Helm. I think he talks about cert manager. Cert manager is different. the Ingress. Cert Manager is if you want to have certificates, like TLS or the SSL certificates, in the cluster, so in some connections in the cluster. So there's two use cases for Cert Manager. Somebody knows which ones are those two? One is to put a certificate uh, on the Ingress controller. When you create an Ingress, you want like HTTPS to come in, hit the controller, terminate that TLS connection, and then create a new TLS connection back to your pod. So that's one use case. So to have that certificate for Ingress controller, to have a certificate for your host name, it needs a certificate. So certificate manager is something that can fetch a certificate or create a self-signed certificate you can see here, and then create the secret that Nginx will use to hit that. But the second one that a lot of people use, anyone want to guess? Very popular cert manager. Go
API
ahead.
gateway. Oh, sorry.
No,
API server to hit
the
API
API.
server.
No, actually, no. For the hitting the API server, if you take I think Jack this recently you do the like the CKA, you create your own PKIs and all that stuff, and then put that in the API server. But Cert Manager doesn't handle the API server. So the second use case is for validation and mutation webhooks, and now policy validation, because you could have at some point, I think I remember at some point the API server, yes, so you're correct, Satish, is not to hit the API server, but it's like when the API server needs to talk to a validation webhook when the request comes in, that needs to do an admission webhook, right? A mission controller. It was going to call a validation or mutation webhook on any controllers, like pick up an add-on, application load balancer controller, crossplane, Argo CD, Istio, Linkerd, anything that has a CRD usually has a validation webhook to validate the values, also a mutation webhook to inject the defaults. It cannot do HTTP. It has to be HTTPS, the connection from the API server to your pod. And the information that you provide to the API server is usually an internal service from inside the cluster. So it will be like my controller dot namespace svc, right? This is where you can like call my validation webhook in my controller. Now you need to have a certificate, an SSL certificate, to be able to handle HTTPS clients connecting. And then now the API server needs to have the CA part of it to say, I trust that server. So Cert Manager is kind of like the canonical way that in Kubernetes everybody have used to solve that issue of like, I'm running a controller. I don't know the host name, that I need to use to create a TLS key pair, to create a CA, to create a certificate, a CSR, all those things. So Cert Manager, that's why it's very popular, the project. Any questions? Sorry, I think I heard
So,
someone.
so for me, I separate Cert Manager out of my clusters. I set up a reverse proxy on a separate server because I don't want to have an IP address for each of my clusters. So I can have a smaller number of IP addresses and a larger number of clusters by separating out the Cert Manager function in a separate reverse proxy, not running in Kubernetes.
Yes. So your use case is to when people want to access your API server, like to do kubectl type of things you're saying, or to
Yeah,
ask,
yeah,
or to
or even the applications.
applications. Yeah.
I have a whole bunch of applications, but I don't have a whole bunch of IP addresses. And so if I split things across multiple clusters, I can't afford to I just don't have an IP address available for each of my clusters. So I have a separate reverse proxy with its own cert manager sitting outside of Kubernetes, that takes the traffic in, and then in the LAN forwards it, redirects it to the appropriate cluster.
Yep. Is that you have that running in a computer, like a Linux computer?
Yeah, it's an Ubuntu
And
computer, and I'm actually using Apache reverse proxy.
okay, and what I'm trying to say is like but you're not running this cert manager pod controller that I have here in front of me.
No, but I'm using.
Okay.
When I was
Okay.
using Cert Manager, I was using it to connect to Let's Encrypt.
Yeah.
And
So just to
I get it
clarify for
completely.
others, right? Like you have something that handles certificates, but it's not cert manager. This cert manager that I'm talking about. Yeah.
No, I'm just using Apache plus Apache configured as a reverse proxy plus Let's Encrypt, and it works great. I just can't have it. I just can't give an IP address to each of my clusters. Kills me.
Yes, that's usually people use F5 and so that's correct. That's the best way to do it when you want to front, like Satish was saying, front the API. The other use case that I was mentioning was inside your cluster when you have controllers. Maybe you don't take a look on some secrets. Like for example, if you install any controller that you install, typical of the operators or controller that you have, what I just explained of that connection being HTTPS, getting the certificate into the API server, this program having a TLS, people use Cert Manager. But if you don't use Cert Manager, then you need to do it yourself, like yourself as a controller. The trick that people do, the trick you might not notice, but what most projects do, they use Helm. Helm has a trick, I don't say a trick, but a feature that says generate me a certificate CA client and TLS and create a secret with that information. So when people install these controllers with Helm is doing that heavy work of creating a key pair TLS behind the scenes, and people don't notice that, hey, it's dropping a secret that then is mounted into your controller. I don't know what typical controllers you have in your do you have an example, Jack, of a controller that you have in your clusters?
I don't know. Does Postgres
like for storage,
Postgres?
for network?
Something for Postgres?
You have a Postgres controller?
Yeah.
Yep. So if Postgres implemented an admission webhook, validation or mutation webhook, look around, you will see that there's a secret that was generated by Helm. Not now, but eventually, right? But that connection between API server and that controller is happening over HTTPS, but it's Helm doing it. The thing that you need to watch is what happens when that expires.
Oh, I have stumbled over that. It is a point of shame. Everything works, and then it doesn't, and then what did I do wrong? And I was like, well, a year ago I forgot to set up a procedure to monitor my certificate expirations. So it's a point of shame.
Yep. No, and it happens in production, right? A lot of people are installing Helm charts. I'm trying to remember if people put their duration in there. I think they put like 7,000 days or something, like to make sure, like, yeah, eventually somebody will delete this cluster and will not like this thing will not expire before that. But if they don't configure it, or maybe you have regulations, security regulations that says like no certificate connected, right? In some of these environments, the network is kind of like in a public domain, right? The kubelet versus the API server, and any certificate being used for that connection, they can say it needs to be rotated every 30 days or every 90 days. So if to meet that requirement, that's where people go into Cert Manager. You put the date in there, and the Cert Manager will rotate and get a new certificate every 30 days, every 90 days. You just need to make sure that your controller is using volumes and listening for the files, so it can like pick up the new one without no downtime. Okay. Anyway, I talk a lot about Cert Manager, but I don't know if it's interested or not, or this information is interested or not. You guys tell me.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, and Sergio is here. Actually, if you have questions, did he drop? I think he was here for a minute. So this chapter, what it it's a good intro, right? It shows you how to install the Ingress controller using Nginx, install cert manager. And this is where he shows how to install the Nginx Ingress installation. One thing to notice is when you have a Ingress and you install Ingress like this, sometimes these Helm charts will run the container of the Ingress in host port, and it will say host network, or maybe just say host. Let's say that it says host port. So Nginx, you install it, and it has the controller, which also is a data plane. That's another unique thing that I not never, but found interesting, that Nginx is both a controller and a data plane. So traffic goes through this controller, while at the same time this controller is trying to reconcile Ingress's object from the API. You ask me, maybe there's a mode where I can separate those two concerns, but it's one. But the thing is, the data plane part of it runs in port by default in Nginx when you install it. It runs in host port, and it runs in host port. I'm not sure. I need to go back, but people run it in host port 80 and 443. So that host port will run on the host, and sometimes they use a different port. But anyway, that was the interesting point about Nginx. He has an example of an app that he deployed. Like, he deploys Nginx as an example, exposes as a service, and then Nginx, when you create an ingress, it points to that Nginx. And notice this here, this annotation. Anyone can tell what that annotation? What is it? Why is it there? It says cert manager / cluster issuer. So that annotation is what indicates to cert manager saying, hey, this is a ingress object you should handle, and you should be creating the secrets, the TLS, the certificates for this ingress into the Nginx namespace. So Nginx has this certificate. If not, then cert manager doesn't know which ingresses objects you want me to work with or not work with. So you have to indicate it through that. And then it will be a similar way on when you create validation webhook or mutation webhook. You can also put an annotation in those YAML files, like a CRD, for example. In a CRD, you put that annotation. Not in the CRD, my bad. When the validation webhook and mutation webhook objects, you put a similar annotation saying, hey, insert the CA bundle and the CA certificate into there, so the Kube API server knows what to use. And then so this is an example of the Nginx. And then when there's traffic hitting that IP address of one of the Nginx controllers, you can usually have multiple replicas. It will detect the host that is specified here. Where is it? The host, in this case, my nginx.test. It will know that it's TLS. It will check the certificate created by cert manager, present it to the client, terminate the connection, and create a new connection. If that's the normal way of using Nginx. That's the layer 7 traffic.
So I have a comment about this. I've set up some kind of complicated combinations of hosts plus paths, where the redirect URL needs to drop the path. And just a little bit more complicated just because of my setup. And I've had to get into the internals of the nginx.conf file that gets generated by the Ingress controller to debug it. And it's just one notch mysterious to me why some things work and some things don't, such that I had to learn the internals of Nginx to debug. And so do you have any words of wisdom, or should I just be using Traffix or something else?
No, Nginx is very powerful. I mean, a lot of people use it and use it in
Yeah, I
production.
think I
Actually,
shoot myself in the foot. I think that's what I do, but it's complicated enough that I have to go into the internals. I actually have to exec into the controller and read the Nginx config file to see what gets generated to troubleshoot. And so,
oh, that's a good way of troubleshooting. Actually,
well,
that's
well,
one of
that's
the
what I've
best
had
way
to
to
do.
troubleshoot.
So,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
anyway, if you have any questions on how to do that, so
Yeah.
to me, it's a little bit of the school of hard knocks, and it should be easier, or I shouldn't have to. It should be harder for me to shoot myself in the foot. And so, I still use Nginx because I think it's the best practice. Do
Yeah.
other people use something different? Is this just any other words of wisdom on this?
Um, the thing is, there's other ones. Nginx is very popular because there's a lot of examples out there. The
Hmm.
only thing I would say is using Nginx, always go to their documentation. They have like, I don't know, like 40 or 30 annotations to do
Hmm.
different things, like dropping the target on things. The wisdom that I will give you is, if you go with Ingress, for example, the Ingress object, then it doesn't matter if it's contour handling it or traffic handling it. You will still do things through annotations, right?
Okay.
If you want to do some
Yeah.
special thing, the next level of like, if you want to like go to the next level of like abstraction, or like instead of using this Ingress because it has some ergonomics problems, which we recognize and the community recognize, that's why we call it V1. It's like, this is V1. You can use it for whoever was using it V1. If you want to like modernize, then use the API gateway API. I don't know if you have seen it or
Oh,
not,
I've
right?
heard about it. It sounded too new for someone like me to use, and
And they
so
have the Nginx has an implementation. So basically, you create a gateway now instead of having one YAML file, right? Like it's a trade-off. Like, you either have one YAML file resource with a bunch of annotations, or you have like a YAML file for specifying the gateway, a YAML file to specify the routing, and another like it's called HTTP route, and another YAML file. Like, I think you have like 3 YAML files objects to do.
okay.
But then the one that you modify a lot of them, it becomes smaller. The other one just static information in API
Let
gateway.
me make a note of that. I want to research that a little bit. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Um, and take into account where do you run, right? So if you run in your own hardware and things, you have a good time, because you can pick any of the implementations. There are different levels. Contour has one, Istio has one. Like, all the major projects, open source projects, have an implementation of it. um and in
Well,
AWS,
that's enough to scare me
it's called
away.
VPC.
Oh no. But okay, noted. Anyway, noted. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, so examples of Ingress that you were asking, if you want to use Nginx or you want to something else. Ingress is based, trying to think, C++ is written, and all the plugins need to be C++, if I'm mistaken, in Ingress. The other one is another one, popular one that I know friends that work there. Like, this came, I think, from VMware. Contour. So Contour is a good one. Also, Contour is based on Envoy, so it's a very cheap version of using Envoy. And I have it here, actually. Let me just read.
Contour. Okay.
Envoy, and then Envoy, in terms of plugin and extensibility, that's why people would use something like Envoy, because then they can write Wasm for Envoy or Lua for Envoy to do kind of like complex things inside their company. Also, Envoy is very lightweight, and also very proven, because it's also used in Istio, as a sidecar, as a main proxy thing. So Contour was created to make something less complex than Istio, for example. So Contour was implemented to just implement the Ingress gateway, where Istio was creating kind of like something beyond Ingress. But now we're coming back to, like, you don't have to use Istio. You can use an abstraction called API Gateway API, and then Istio will have an implementation behind it. But Contour is also good. Traffic, also very good.
Okay.
Don't know much about the internals of Traffic, in what language is it written, but I know it came from Rancher, and SUSE, I believe, the project. If somebody knows
So
better.
I could keep my Nginx Ingress controller as is and add a second Ingress controller
Yep.
based on Envoy,
Yep.
right? I mean, I read that, but implementing that, I should be able to do that. That should be, I can imagine
Yeah,
doing
this
that.
this
Pretty
is this
straightforward,
is
right?
the trick that I said. Like you have to put the notation of like what's the Ingress class
Yeah, I do
to
that.
put
I
in
do
there,
that,
and
even though I
yeah,
only
and
have
then which
one.
one,
Yeah.
and then which one will handle it.
Okay. All right.
And
Noted.
this is the same thing as in the cloud provider. Usually, cloud provider has a Ingress controller to instead of to create like appliances in their cloud. So in this case, like in AWS, we create a
Yeah.
ELB, and then you put the Ingress class. But like I said before, put it as a spec, Ingress class name spec, not an annotation like you see. But some of them still handle the annotations, but it might be that some of them will stop handling the annotation at some point. Yeah, so that's
Thank you. I'll let you
contour
know what I learned.
traffic.
Thank you. I'll let you know what I learned. Okay,
Yeah, no problem, Jack. Thank you for the questions. And so here you can see contour also influence contour, like folks from contour also influence the API gateway API. I think they were part of the first people maintainers to start like designing the API for API gateway API. So you have that here, and contour has another example. This object called HTTP proxy, right? That you can have here on some features on top of just the Ingress. So you can have that proxy in there. So for example, this is rate limiting policy, right? So contour on top of handling your Ingress can have a second type of CR called HTTP proxy, and it can do this type of features. Let me see. And then Sergio actually wrote here like pros and cons between traffic, Nginx, and contour. So that's interesting. Yeah, like he mentions here, contours from the VMware folks uses Envoy, the pros and cons. Nginx, don't say if it says the C++, and traffic from Traffic Labs. So maybe I wasn't wrong. I was wrong on the Rancher thing. Maybe it's Traffic Labs, not Rancher. But I know that K3s from Rancher uses traffic by default. Maybe that's why I thought about that. And I think that's it for Nginx. The other chapter was Linkerd, but also interesting in terms of networking on like Sergio has an example of like in the other ones just like shifting traffic rate limiting with contour. On this one he shows how to split the traffic between two things like 50%, and he shows like on one faulty container and then the other one good, and you can see like flipping from 200 to 500, 200 to 500. And Linkerd is written in Rust, I believe, right? Somebody can confirm? I think it's written in Rust, very low footprint, doesn't have that many CRs as Istio. Also used in the industry. And then the only thing I can say, next thing about Linkerd that happened recently, they changed their license. And also the release process. I think the stable releases are now only done by Linkerd, the company. And then if you want the open source version, just pick up whatever is on master. I think it is main branch. That happened, I believe, was last year. It was in the stack and some blog posts around that deadline. The change of their license / business model for Linkerd. And it shows Sergio shows here that he opens the GUI, which comes with default, you install it by default, and then it opens Grafana. So I don't know if he's set up Grafana or this Grafana came as an option installed with Linkerd. I wasn't sure because I didn't try it. But it's nice to see an example of using a dashboard, right? How your requests are coming in and that information. But I think maybe it was maybe it's part of the Helm chart by default if you install Grafana with that. I'm guessing it's not using Prometheus, just scraping the metrics from Linkerd. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Maybe that's something that people want to discuss next, like observability stacks and monitoring stacks. What is out there? What is the how to get started?
That would interest me greatly. But the thing is, this is an edge computing book that's really a excellent just Kubernetes overview best practices book.
See?
So you read Edge in the title and go, oh yeah, Edge is interesting. I might do Edge someday. Let me look somewhere else.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things here that are independent of Edge that I find very valuable.
Yeah, that's the feedback I was trying to say to when I showed the menu on the 600 pages. Is I realized he covered a lot. Like spent a lot of time writing this book. We have to ask him how much time he spent because, like you said, it covers all the topics of Kubernetes. It happens that you're using a small computer, right? Like, but it covers all the topics, and on top of that topic, he has multiple projects and example for one topic, right? So you could have written a chapter talking about Ingress with one controller, Nginx. Like, why talk about Contour and why talk about Linkerd traffic and why compare them, right? And why show an example, working example of the three, right? And move along. So and that was good. But yeah, I agree with Jack. This is what I said at the beginning. This book is almost like the what's the other book? Production Kubernetes in production.
Good question. Sitting here.
Kubernetes in production, maybe it is.
Yeah,
but it's the one that we took. It took us like
Production
a year
Kubernetes.
to read.
Wasn't it from Josh?
Yeah. So that's the first book we did here in the Kubernetes book club. And it took a year. I think I have it in the blog post, how long it took, how many months.
700 pages or something.
Because it's almost like this one. Like we went over every chapter and we discussed every chapter. I was learning all these things at that time on different. Maybe I knew the technology because of one project, but then I learned other projects that implement the same technology. And also like controllers. They had good chapters on controllers and automation. But this one is also like second to that one, like 600 pages of Kubernetes with examples, screenshots, and things. And he figured out how to run on something that is not a big server, right? Raspberry Pi. You can run all these examples in Raspberry Pi. Okay, so that's it for today. I need to jump, but thank you so much for folks joining. I will see you next week.
Can we try to cover maybe two? Oh God, I've just remembered that I might not join next week, but I'll keep you posted. I was going to say just like every episode, if you try to cover maybe 2 chapters, maybe
maybe the next one we cover monitoring. I think monitoring has it next. Right, SQL and databases. I think we already covered.
Yeah.
Maybe what's the next one? I think it was. Yeah, monitoring is the next one. Cover with something else, right? 2 or 3 chapters. LoRa, I think we can skip because I don't have a LoRa device, and this is very specific to that device. Yeah, some examples are specific to you had the devices or not, but maybe that's the last one. We do monitoring. Or monitoring, and we would do something around AI, and then that's it. We finish the book, and we try to find another book that people want to talk.
Sure.
We'll have to see which books are being released recently. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very good. It's very good. Thank you
see
for
everybody.
the discussion.
Yep. Bye.
Have a lovely weekend, everyone, and
have a great weekend, people.
Bye.
Bye-bye.